Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sunset TV. I'm Tina Jha. You're watching Perspective. The foreign ministers of the Quad grouping of India, the United States, Australia and Japan vowed to work vigorously to achieve the grouping's shared vision of a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific and collectively deal with common threats like terrorism. At the Quad foreign ministers meeting in Melbourne on Friday, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi and Australia's Marise Payne reaffirmed their support to principles of openness, protection of national sovereignty and observance of rules and fair play. To put things into perspective on the crucial meeting and vision of the Quad grouping, I am joined on the program today by an eminent panel of experts. So let me begin the program first by introducing them to you. I have with me former Ambassador Navdeep Sarna. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us on the program. Dr. Sreeram Chaulia is a foreign affairs expert. Thank you, Dr. Chaulia, for joining us on this edition of Perspective. And from Washington, D.C., joining me is Ms. Elizabeth Braw, Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute. Ms. Braw, thank you and welcome to Sunset TV. Dr. Chaulia, let me begin the program today with you first by understanding what, according to you, were the key highlights of the Quad foreign ministers meeting, very, very crucial one given the current geopolitical events.
Very much so, Tina. I think, first of all, it reaffirmed from the rest of the partners the faith in the US that the US had not forgotten the Indo-Pacific because of the ongoing tensions with Russia over Ukraine and over the security architecture in Europe. There was a concern in our region that maybe the US was being drawn away again into other theaters. Yes. It has happened in the past, a kind of a grand strategic diversion. So the Quad ministerial reaffirms that faith that the US has not abandoned this region, and certainly it cannot afford to do so. And they're showing it in the form of Secretary of State Antony Blinken coming all the way to Australia. I think if you see the ministerial outcome at the end of it, it was quite strong in language. The word that stood out and which many have picked up is coercion. So they made a very clear, challenge to Chinese coercion and Chinese hegemony and expansionism in the region. And from time to time, this must be in the international discourse. And I think these kind of ministerials and of course the summits, we have had Quad summits. It's become a new trend now, and there's going to be one more. So those will, reinforce that message that there is a problem in Asia. There's a problem of imbalance and of unlawful and aggressive conduct by a kind of a preponderantly powerful country, and that must be stopped in its tracks. And I think so that kind of messaging has gone out, and that's good. A lot of nitty-gritty items were also discussed across the range of topics for cooperation, like you have COVID-19 vaccines. Already Quad have committed to it. The infrastructure projects, they haven't gotten off as much as we would have liked them to be, but there is a plan for a Quad Build Back Better for the world kind
Absolutely.
of initiative.
And these are issues, and the kind of progress that we have made on this front is something that I'll discuss in the course of the program. Dr. Chaulia, in terms of supporting the ASEAN, what are the steps that have been taken by the four-country grouping in recent years?
Well, Tina, one thing is that the Quad ministerial talked about deepening the cooperation with regional partners. And when they say regional partners, they obviously ASEAN is the most important of them all.
Yes.
And if you look at the building blocks, it's Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines. These are the three countries with whom the Chinese have territorial disputes and who have faced the heat in the South China Sea and beyond, and who have been looking for external support to be able to hold their own against the Chinese juggernaut. So definitely more military exercises, more joint actions we are doing bilaterally with the ASEAN countries, because ASEAN countries are wary of being seen to be joining the Quad. They don't want to be formally part of Quad, but there are other means by which we are doing it. Apart from that, even smaller island nations, for example, the ministerial was talking about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Now, Dr. Jaishankar just tweeted that we have supplied COVID-19 relief medical supplies to the tiny island of Kiribati, which is one of those very small Pacific Island countries, via Australian cooperation. Same thing we are doing with Japan. Together, we are trying to build ports and infrastructure in the Indian Ocean countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar. So what I'm trying to say is that this kind of pairing up with key countries in the region, meeting their practical needs, as Ambassador Sarna is saying,
Yes.
and offering a what we call diversification, meaning these countries should not be in a kind of a debt trap for China and should not become de facto colonies of China. That is the real fear. So I think to push that back, we are taking many concrete initiatives in third countries, meaning Quad countries in other partner countries, and sometimes in a group. Sometimes, for example, the Pacific Islands is an entire grouping, and they have been facing a lot of pressure from China. There is even talk of fishing. Why? Where does fishing come into Quad? That's because the Chinese trawlers, deep motorized trawlers, are completely devastating the coasts of many countries and are depleting the reserves and not even caring about the livelihood of farmers from those small countries in the region. So there is we have mapped out the threats. We have mapped out the major threats to defense and military and national security. That's one. And then there are human security issues, human development issues, health care, all these things, and telecommunications, 5G rollout. There is going to be a Quad initiative to provide alternatives. So if you add up all that, we've got the strategy. Only thing is attention, strategic attention, and resources need to be put in. I just want to mention one thing about Australia. They hosted it. They were so grateful that all the remaining 3 foreign ministers came. Why? Because they are facing tremendous economic coercion from China. Since Australia raised the issue of the origins of COVID-19, the Chinese have been so nasty to Australia. They have imposed a blanket, economic boycott and have hurt Australian exporters. So how did Quad come in? Quad countries offered to buy more Australian wine, more Australian agriculture products, and so on and so forth, which the Chinese were blocking and imposing tariffs and barriers. So this is how we help each other. If we have a national security crisis, the remaining 4 Quad countries should come to our resistance. If the Australians are under coercion, the remaining should come and show us, not just solidarity in terms of words, but through actual policies. I think that's what now we are able to do. And surely the Chinese are worried about this. They may sound nonchalant, or they say they don't care about Quad or so on, but they're paying attention. And I can tell you that they are hot under the collar. They are not liking it.
Dr. Chaulia, so we've discussed about what happened at the meeting, but largely talking about the grouping and its future. What are the kind of challenges, particularly coming from China's hegemonic designs, the challenges that this grouping faces, and how do you look at its future?
Well, I think main thing, Tina, is to manage the expectations. I mean, some people, the so-called Asian NATO idea, I mean, we cannot go that far. I mean, many of us are wary of entering into alliance type of, formal treaty alliance type of relationship. So, and then the other is the economic, interdependence of many countries across the Indo-Pacific with China. So that kind of makes it a lot harder, because the smaller countries do want an alternative, and they're looking for alternatives. So providing economic, framework that can be like a choice. I mean, if you are one of the small countries in the region, let's say you're Laos or Cambodia, I mean, historically, you've been, in the Chinese pockets. What do you do? What do Quad do? I mean, Myanmar is the biggest case, right? I mean, we all say that we want democracy, and the Quad is underpinned by democratic values. But to what extent we should support restoration of democracy there, and how do we do it? There will be, differences like you mentioned. So I think North Korea, apparently the Quad, all 4 agreed, because Japan wants it. North Korea was condemned, and its ballistic missile tests were condemned. India wants to bring terrorism into the picture, like you said at the beginning, although the other countries seem to be somewhat less concerned about it, especially Australia and Japan. But nonetheless, there is a problem of, jihadist groups in the region. In Indonesia, for example, in the Philippines, we have had a resurgence of ISIS mentality and ISIS affiliated groups and Al-Qaeda type of organizations. So we do need to keep an eye on all this. So I think main thing is to show presence, especially maritime presence, combined maritime presence. And second, I believe, like I said before, joint works and public works and projects, but that is where the Chinese are far ahead of us. Even all four of us put together cannot match the kind of infrastructure projects that the Chinese have been operating through the Belt and Road Initiative. So President Biden spoke about the Build Back Better for the World, B3W. And there is a version of it for the Indo-Pacific. We need to strengthen that. We need to tie up with the Europeans also, because they are big investors in the region, and jointly do a lot of projects. My view is, you can only keep a country like Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Laos in a balance if we are able to also put up the money and say we are also willing to finance, a power project or a dam or a bridge. Mm-hmm. And that's where, the Chinese have an advantage. So I think we must focus on infrastructure, and that will be a big challenge. The vaccine response has been great. And I think that's one more area where we are doing better than the Chinese. The Chinese dumped hundreds of millions of their vaccines in this whole region and beyond. They were totally wasteful because they did not protect anybody. The Chinese vaccines have very low efficacy, but Indian-made vaccines with with Western cooperation have been far more successful. So I think we have to, muscle our way in through these kind of creative interventions to make this whole region believe and have hope that Quad is something that is good for us. It is, like Ambassador said, a force for good, which Absolutely. Will balance and give more options and freedom to all these countries in the region. It's not just freedom of navigation. I would say freedom of foreign policy choices. That's what Quad should provide for everyone.
So I think with that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of Perspective. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers.